First off, real quick, mic check. We doing good back there on the mic? Awesome.
Good.
Okay. Thank you all for coming out. I'm actually really excited about this talk. One, because it's just a fun talk, but also it has nothing to do with domain authority, which is all I've been doing for the last 3 weeks. This came to me a long time ago. I just realized that I had the gift of bullshitting. And some people might call it like the gift of gab or whatever, but just being able to carry on conversations about things you don't really know that much about. Well, it turns out that marketers have to do that a lot, especially search engine marketers. We are constantly asked to produce high quality, authoritative content on topics for which we have no business whatsoever commenting.
Yes.
Over the course of a decade working at Verante, which is now High Digital, we went through this process a number of times and refined all sorts of different techniques. And I put them together into a simple deck that will hopefully kind of explain how to do this really quickly in a pinch. And even when not in a pinch, some kind of unique methods that you can use to get all of the checkboxes ticked off that you want. So, this is obviously not a real email, but we can pretend that it is. Client reaches out to you asking for an article. They just want to see what progress you've made, and you recognize that you haven't spent any time on it. The obvious response to that is shit. So what do? You can lie, stall, and give excuses. This is kind of the normal business solution, which is saying our writer got sick or something of that sort. But we're going to use that. I prefer a different approach. Who here watched MacGyver? At least familiar with the concept of MacGyver?
Yes, we're old.
Okay. The older you are, the more you are. So we're gonna MacGyver this. So what does this mean for those of you who are too young for MacGyver? The idea is to use every available resource, normally in bizarre and unique ways, to accomplish a seemingly impossible task. So every episode of MacGyver is essentially the same. This random guy just happens to end up in impossible situations, like there's a bomb that's going to go off and all he has is a paper clip and a diaper or something ridiculous like that, and somehow he opens up the diaper. It turns out the diaper stuff is super absorbent, and he uses that to suck out the chemicals inside, something insane. And by the end of the day, he's saved everybody's life. But my goal here is to kind of use things you already know how to do, but in unique ways, so that we can actually produce content of high quality really quick. So the goal, we want to produce thorough, authoritative, attractive article on the concept of spring garden in less than 24 hours with minimal work and expenditures. I've only delivered this talk once before, and I did this. I kind of set the task for myself. I have to accomplish this in 24 hours. Otherwise, what's the point of the piece if it actually doesn't work? So the first question that is going to happen when you don't know a topic is just, how do you get to the prompt? What are you actually going to write about? So I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to do that. Obviously, I'm going to use Moz for some of it, but I'll show you free versions wherever possible. So in Keyword Explorer, I would just type in something like spring garden, and then there are options that are really valuable, like selecting I only want questions, and then you can group the keywords together for lexical similarity. Now, actually what that means is that keywords that are really, really similar to one another will end up in the same group. So like when to plant your spring garden will probably also have under it when you should plant your spring garden, or when should I plant my spring garden. Very similar concepts. And by grouping it, there's an extra value that you get out of that, because post-Hummingbird, we know that these long authoritative pieces of content will rank for lots of different keywords. Of course, there are places to get questions without keywords. AnswerThePublic.com is probably the most well-known, but you can also use Ubersuggest and a number of other tools out there, keywordtool.io as well. So the theme that I was able to garner from just a couple of minutes, and you'll notice in the bottom, I'm kind of keeping a tally of the minutes that I've worked to make this happen, were tips on planting a spring garden, when and what flowers, when and what vegetables. Those were the 3 questions that just kind of came out as a theme. And they're pretty obvious, but if we want to write something authoritative, we're going to have to get a lot more specific. So we start with some simple organization. I mean, this is outlining like you're in middle school. Doesn't really take anything. And then the first thing we do is we go for the easy answers. Luckily, Google makes a lot of this stuff stupid simple, like what to plant in a spring garden. Look, there you go. 1 minute, I've got a list. Asking about bulbs, they'll just list all sorts of different things you should plant in the spring. But also in the same featured snippet, you learn that there is a difference between bulbs that you plant in the spring to come out in the fall versus ones you planted in the fall to bloom in the spring. Which, there we go. There's some new interesting information that we might want to be able to answer in this authoritative article on spring gardens. So when to plant vegetables in the spring, you answer the same question. And what's really cool about featured snippets is that essentially they're essentially writing your article for you. As you'll see later, we do a lot of copying and pasting. But then you paraphrase, and then you cite the source, which if you've ever written a paper in college, is exactly what you do. There's the only difference now is there's this really great algorithm out there that's giving you the answers as opposed to you actually having to peer through the book to find it in the first place. Same thing here, when to plant flowers in the spring. So we're getting easy answers, and we're using that to build up this organization of the piece. Timekeeper. At this point, we've spent 13 minutes, and we'll go back. We've got this kind of organization laid out. And now it's time to start filling things up. How do we get expert answers? We don't want to just get whatever the featured snippets are. So what we start doing is extracting information from the community. The web is filled with all sorts of different resources, places where people are answering questions for free, not realizing that they're helping you do your marketing job. So the first thing I would say is divide and conquer. What we'll do is write down questions that we need to answer as part of the article, and then associate them with various different resources on the web where we can ask those questions and get answers. And then second, I'll talk about how we use clever titles or methodologies to encourage people to answer questions more readily, more quickly, and more thoroughly. So this is like the stupidest slide I've ever made. It's just a picture of Sublime. And if you notice, this is like, I've got it on 3 computers and only 1 is unregistered, and I just happened to do the unregistered one, so that looks super classy. But you'll see I've got thread 1, thread 2, thread 3, and what I'm doing slowly but surely is posting to various different discussion boards and various different forums, etc., questions to be answered, so that I can then go back and check later to make sure, or to see if there are any results. So the first thing I would do is focus on forums. I know they're old school, but the reality is that most of the experts and the things you are writing about are not technology experts. So they're still old school. They're still using forums. The number of forums on gardening was just ridiculous. There are just so many, whatever, for some reason it's popular. In this case, I actually paid to join one just to see, because there's one that is so good that you pay to get into. It was really good. Dave's Garden, it's this one, where was it? Dave's Garden Forums. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Did you factor that into the price of the project?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yes, I did. The next thing is Q&A sites. These are everywhere, and they still work. People still respond. And then one that I really like to use or take advantage of is Twitter. Most of the people who respond on Twitter are looking to increase their own stature in the community, so they're more than willing to answer questions, especially if you tell them it's going to be in an article and that you're going to cite them. There's a really great tool out there by a company called ScoutZen, and it used to be called Electoral HQ, but you can type in any kind of topic and it will find Twitter lists. So it's like the most unused feature on Twitter, but you can make curated lists of people by topic. So for example, I typed in garden, and the second one is Alyssa Milano's list of gardeners that she follows. But the next, if you go down a couple, there's like Easy Gardening, and they've got 388 members. That means that there are 388 different experts in gardening that they've curated for you. So, I would just click on, like, this one was Garden Guru List that had 265 members, and each one of these people is getting added with a question in order to answer my questions for the article. The Twitter one part probably takes the longest because you're working with a one person, one question kind of thing, and you'll often want to ask the same question to multiple people, because if somebody doesn't respond, you still need an answer to it. Now, here's where the trickiness gets in. Here's where we want to be more effective than the average person asking the average question. If somebody asked me, what should I plant in my spring garden, and I knew about gardening, I would do exactly what I said we did earlier, which is look for the easy answers in Google. Just let me Google that for you. But there are different techniques you can use to get people involved. So one is disgust. So I'll start a question like, broccoli, anything better for a spring garden? And what you're going to get is two types of responses. One, yes, I hate broccoli too. You should do this. The other person says, broccoli's great, blah, blah, blah. Here's why you should plant it. And now you've got all kinds of great information because you've essentially pissed off half the people and made the other half, joining in on your side and coming to your defense. There's desperation. Someone stopped me before I intentionally murder this garden. How do I keep the pests out? Just something that just says, I really need help fast, and it really is this bad. So yeah, this was my favorite. I actually photoshopped blood onto the hoe. And then bad advice. I know I can't plant broccoli next to squash. What other plants do I need to keep away from each other? Of course you can plant them next to each other. But now everybody's going to chime in and say, what are you talking about? They go well together. The ones that you can't plant next to each other are X, Y, and Z, and you're off to the races. So there are all sorts of different ways that you can write titles in getting these answers that will encourage people to respond more quickly, which is one thing that's very important. We want answers now, and also more thoroughly. Now there's this one thing that's known as Cunningham's Law, which is the best way to get the right answer on the internet is not to ask a question, it is to answer it incorrectly. This is the greatest comic ever made as far as I'm concerned, short of Calvin and Hobbes. Which is, are you coming to bed? I can't, it's important, someone's wrong on the internet. Which is, I mean, every single one of you at some point you're like, they're wrong,
Yes.
and I've got something else to do, but nothing's more important. Cancer treatment, damned, we are going to respond. So bad advice. This is one of my favorite techniques. So you'll answer the "let me Google that for you" or ask the "let me Google that for you" question. It's kind of boring, but then you create another account and you respond to it with an incorrect answer, and immediately people start responding. So I think for one of them was the broccoli thing. I responded to, what you really need to do is lower the pH of the soil by a whole lot. What I would recommend you do, and it was like, it was something like, I didn't go so far as saying put hydrochloric acid in there or something, but it was pretty bad. And obviously, the response is coming, it's like, I don't know who this guy is, I think he's just trolling you. What you really need to do is this. So, back to the organization that we had before, and at this point we're at 84 minutes of effort. We now need to do some novel research. You can't get away with just regurgitating exactly what everybody else has said. Well, the best solution, there is novel research available on every single topic that you could ever imagine, and it's through Google Trends. Google Trends is fantastic for this because literally anything that people search, you can get an idea of proportionality and relationships and start making inferences from it. So this was the comparison of, I want to say like broccoli, bell peppers, and green beans or something of that sort. And then this was interest by Metro for dahlias, which is a type of flower. And so you can see that they're more popular on the east coast of North Carolina than they are towards the Piedmont. But broccoli, on the other hand, has a broader popularity. And what's neat about these is that it's not just giving you a story that you can tell as part of your research, where you're saying, well, experts will tell you that you can plant this, this, and this, and this. It's particularly popular in North Carolina to plant so-and-so. And now you've got a picture or a graph or a table or some sort of data behind it as well that you can put into your article. Now, that kind of unique imagery is really important. We all know that Google is looking for these immersive experiences that are going to make the user want to stay on the page, not just a long piece of text. So how do we get unique imagery? This is the one that is my favorite hack, and it's cheap and 100% effective. I stand by it. So you start with your topic and just put it in Google. Spring vegetable garden. Now, you could just like copy and paste these images in, but obviously
That would be wrong.
that would be wrong. But most importantly, now you're going to want to cite it and link to them and do all sorts of stuff, blah blah blah. So I got a cheap trick. It's called Fiverr, and everybody knows Fiverr. But all you do is you search for illustration on Fiverr, and you find people who will convert raster images to vector images. Raster would be things you take with camera, actual real-world photos. Vector images would be line art. So, for example, I took a picture of a dahlia, and then I gave them this, and this is what, for $5, I got within a couple of hours of somebody who just literally took a pen with their tablet and traced it and gave me a dahlia. So, pulling it all together, we've got all its organization, and we're going to start the copy-paste process. So, for example, we have this question of when to start planting. So I have copied and pasted the answer that Google gave me, and you see there's a URL directly under it, so that I can cite the resources. We live in a day and an age where it's really not that bad to link out as long as what you're doing is showing that you've done your homework. I do the same thing with copying and pasting information on tulips, and this one actually came from a wiki that I had posted a question to. And then we start replacing quotes with paraphrases. This is exactly what you would do in college writing a paper, but you would leave the citations. And then one of the things that I really like to do is, so let's say I've got 40 answers to questions or 30 answers to questions. There are a dime a dozen content rewriters on Fiverr. You could also do it on Mechanical Turk. I would use a human any day over using one of these auto spinning solutions. The only halfway decent one is Word AI. But I would just start different tasks. Assign a different rewrite to every different person. Let's say they'll rewrite 100 words. Well, then I'll copy one of the answers. It's 100 words. And that way, what you've immediately done is turn yourself into a team of content rewriters, with 20, 30, or 50 strong, depending on how much you need rewritten. So a quote, like, depending on the zone and how early the spring, blah, 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 becomes planting directly outdoors can work if you're careful regarding the planting zone. And as you can see, you end up with a completely different piece of content. And it's valid and accurate. Of course, you're still going to want to cite, but it's unique. Now, what I like to do is take that article rewrite and then kind of blow it up. I want to be as comprehensive and thorough as possible. There's this fantastic tool, dandelion.eu, which will give you entities if you put in any kind of concept, or any kind of content. So I copied and pasted that exact same set of sentences, and you'll see that it's highlighted outdoors and spring and bulb and temperatures, flowers, tulip, zone, fall, etc. And all of these are various different entities that Dandelion has identified. Well, each entity is an opportunity to expand, especially if it's an entity that is less known by the community. So for example, the word zone is selected there, which is a hardiness zone. So I decide to start expanding. So you'll see planting directly outdoors can work if you're careful regarding the planting zone. That was what the article was rewritten. But now I've added in parentheses a definition of exactly what planting zones are and why they're important. When we get to tulips, I take the same sort of data that I got from Dandelion and rewrite it, just saying that tulips including certain hybrid cultivars known as botanical tulips, blah, blah, blah. And I keep doing this over and over and over again throughout the document. Now, for sake of time and laziness, I happen to just always put these in parentheses, but you can put them in comments, write entire sentences or paragraphs based on them as well. But once again, you know, I came into this well, I had a vague concept of what a hardiness zone is, but not a really good one. But I'm still able to produce content about it now based on using this entity expansion. Now we can go and we can add all of our graphs, the broccoli by region, and then we can add and explain all of the images. So this was a different dahlia. I actually sent it to 2 different artists. They did a tulip, they did a guy digging, they did a cornucopia. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to make sure that all of my content has authoritative language. This is I've described it before as the saddest failure of my life. NTopic is a really awesome tool that works half the time, but will tell you all of the words, phrases that you ought to include.
We're up to 99%.
What?
We're up to 99%.
Yes. Well, now that Jake's in control of it, it works better. But yeah, it'll tell you all of the words and phrases that you ought to be using in order to make your content authoritative. So as you can see, in this case, I just copied and pasted some random text. But in order to write about spring garden flowers, I need to cover a large number of things, like not just spring garden flowers, but roses and bouquet, plant, shop, early, etc. And you'll just go down the list and you'll find more and more and more words that you ought to be including. Finally, cleaning up. One of the greatest tools out there is Hemingway app. If you're not a very good writer, or at least not confident in what you write, I would highly recommend taking advantage of this tool. All it does is just make you a better writer. It helps you deal with passive and active sentences. It helps you make sure that you're not writing really long sentences, which is a problem of mine. And it's absolutely free, so it's great. Now, what I really like about this is the end product. So instead of just doing this in 24 hours, I decided to spend $100 on Text Broker, buying the highest quality writer that they offer, which is like 66 cents a word or something ridiculous like that, and then asked them to produce an article on this topic. And this is what they gave me, just this long wall of text. And there's absolutely no order or reason to it. Like the 4 basics of spring gardening and then spring planting at a glance. Like why, how do those flow together? It doesn't make any sense. Versus what we did for less than $50. It took 3 hours. Has unique statistics and graphs, links to valuable resources. And this is just the first half of the article. The difference is pretty much night and day in terms of what your user is going to end up experiencing on the site. So what are the kind of takeaways from this? So the first is not procrastinate. You know, just because you can produce good content really, really quickly on the web doesn't mean that you should wait till the last minute to do it. But the real takeaway is that you have absolutely no excuse to produce shit. Like, there are tons of free resources, people begging to write for you across the web in 100 different places, and all that you need to do is just bring those resources together at the same time, and you can accomplish just about anything when it comes to producing content. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to help, but that's it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
How does any of this relate to DA?
He didn't have to go there.
Yeah. Jake.
Yeah, I was wondering, when you were talking about finding all the forums, you didn't mention Reddit. And I was curious if you experimented
Reddit's good.
Yeah.
with reaching out on Reddit.
Reddit is perfectly fine. I find that, as I mentioned before, most of these topics are, if a technologist is unrelated or is really unfamiliar with them. I assume that most of you in here would call yourselves technologists to a degree in the sense that you spend most of your time behind a computer. But a gardener, on the other hand, is much more likely to use forums and these old school places. But of course, there's no reason not to check out Reddit and give it a shot as well.
Did you test what you got back from the writer versus what I guess, what did you do with the content that you get back from the writer?
That's a good question. The first thing that I did was I took both of them and put them into NTopic to do a comparison just to see what was the quality like. Admittedly, I had used NTopic to optimize the article, so it's kind of unfair to some degree. But it was substantially better. I mean, there were huge gaping areas of words and phrases that the article writer just missed. Concepts and topics that unless you're a gardener, you're not going to know to write about. And writers for hire rarely are that specialized. They'll just write on any topic. So that was probably the first test that I ran. I didn't publish the content online to see how it would perform anywhere, but it's certainly worth a shot. But you know, when I have had checklists in the past for what needs to go into a piece of content for me to consider it to be good enough to put online, it hits all the check boxes. So I was pleased in that regard. Yeah.
One route that agencies might take is that if they're not the authority, they might get the client to write, and maybe it wouldn't be much. What would you maybe ask them to write? Like, what guidance would you give them, and then what would you do after they're done?
I've almost never had a good experience asking the client to write. First off, the client is not a writer.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just not their job. In this case, a gardener, they spend no time in front of a computer just writing. I mean, it's bizarre. I mean, can you think of like how many industries are there out there where their expertise involves also writing? It's
But you
very
could prompt
rare.
them, you know, ask questions.
Yeah,
or
so you could do an interview type methodology. The catch here in this particular situation is that they're not supposed to know you haven't started.
Right.
But yeah, interviews are a really great way to do it. And on top of that, if you're a little bit unscrupulous, you can get a billable consulting hour out of it.
Yeah.
So even though they're actually feeding you the information that you need. But yeah, the interviews are a really great way to do it, especially because then it gives you the opportunity to highlight the business owner as the authority and not just all of these other sites that you're citing.
I don't feel unscrupulous billing for that extra.
Good.
Never feel it.
And feel free to ask questions outside of the realm of this presentation. If you really do want to ask.
We were
about
being
domain
nice.
authority, that's perfectly fine.
The Hemingway app that you showed.
Yeah.
So I get it. Like you're supposed to put in content and then it's gonna kind of rewrite it so that it's more authoritative.
It's not
or
going to
no?
rewrite.
Okay.
Hemingway is just going to
Just highlight.
make recommendations for you to restructure the content that you're writing so that it's more readable.
Got it.
And yeah, like the rules like that you were taught in high school, use an active voice and maintaining the same first person or third person perspective throughout the whole thing, maintaining the same tense. Those types of things that you're not going to pay attention to as you're actually copying and pasting from other people's resources. It'll make those recommendations for you. And yeah, it's fantastic.
But the purpose of it is still like ranking, like keyword ranking. I mean, okay. So
Yeah.
it's the authoritative side. Okay.
Yeah.
Just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. What it's doing is it's taking. What I really like about the Hemingway app, as a kind of a last pass, is that I would say the biggest problem with this methodology is that it kind of sounds schizophrenic. Like you've got a lot of different voices, multiple personality disorder, I should say. So the first paragraph is coming from one source, the second paragraph from another, and people might have very different writing styles. Well, the Hemingway app is going to pigeonhole you into a particular writing style. That's a good writing style. It might not be very personal, but at least it will give you a good flow throughout the whole article.
I have a confession. I was really impressed because the Dandelion website, I was really impressed that it had such an advanced tool for gardening blogs. So that was my misunderstanding.
Yeah, Dandelion has nothing to do with Dandelion.
Yeah, I figured that about halfway through.
But there are a ton of other entity extraction tools out there And for some reason, I don't know why, but the industry around NLP, natural language processing tools, all have APIs that have some sort of free tier. And so entity extraction, sentiment analysis, all that kind of stuff that you would want, you can take advantage of. But Dandelion just happens to have the best UX. So if you don't want to write code, you can just use their tool.
I'll be trying it out. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, please.
What was the quality of the rewriters overall?
Yeah.
Curious about that aspect.
So once again, the Hemingway app can be useful for that too, because sometimes the rewriters come back and it's clear that the person is not a native speaker, and you know that's okay. They tried. It's still better than spun content, but yeah, I would say
you could have a lot of rewriters just continually rewrite it till it's good, right? It's like an
Yeah.
army of rewriters.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just take an existing article and
Well,
feed it through a bunch of
what you could do
rewriters.
is you could have two people rewrite it and a third person who's a judge, and they just pick the best one.
Just give the email for the first
Yeah.
rewriter to the second one. Just
Well-
say, hey, whatever you done.
Well,
Rewrite
you know,
it.
eventually, of using these,
That's awesome.
when using these techniques, you're going to find people that you use over and over and over.
Yeah, makes sense.
Eventually the whole article's in Urdu.
Yeah.
What?
This is nonsense.
Yeah. Patrick.
Would you say it's fair that with that rewritten content, like there's no way Google's not going to detect that? Like this is the same thing in a different way, right? Would you say
Topically,
that that's
yes.
successful, that the content you're creating with this is successful because you're doing the other things? You're pulling in the data sources, you're
Well,
pulling in unique imagery.
I don't think that, so, I can never remember the guy's name from Bing.
Dwayne?
At Tech SEO, he talked specifically about how the two documents are going to occupy the same vector space because they're on the same topics, etc. Blah blah blah. Even though the content itself isn't identical, that they can figure out. But that just because they can figure out that they're about exactly the same thing, doesn't mean that the original is better than the latter.
That would only be a block level though too, right? Because you're pulling from
Correct.
all different sources.
Correct. Yeah, so there's a lot of different sources involved, but the two aren't necessarily, it's not like the new one just automatically by default gets canceled out, because it's not like Google only wants one article on spring gardens. They give you 10 results for a reason. But yes, all of the other stuff that goes into it enriches it beyond the point of just copy and paste. That's why there's the whole section on creating novel research. And like I said, using Google Trends is the easiest way to do it. You can also use like AdWords, their API, which is nice because you can say like, in the last 12 months, so-and-so's gone up some particular keyword, some particular, yeah.
So kind of along the same lines, you know, you're using these like rich snippets and you're answering questions and things like that. Are you very strategic about your goal and that you're like, I would like to surpass this snippet and take over this spot? Or like, how do you kind of address that where like, it's like real estate on Google
Yeah.
or whatever?
In this particular situation, I just want to get it past the client. You know, what they're gonna be happy. As for featured snippet optimization, normally once publishing a piece of content, I see where it lands and what keywords that it has the opportunity to. And featured snippets seem to be the only place where keyword stuffing still works. Like they're looking for, it's almost as, well, it's not almost, it is. If you were to grab like the top 100 search results, Google will choose a featured snippet from anywhere in there. Obviously, they give more precedence to the one at the top, or more priority, but it's possible to get featured snippet from, listing number 60 or something of that sort. So we know that the way they go about generating featured snippet, or at least identifying featured snippets, is by somehow concatenating all of the results together and then looking through them to find the best sentence and a half or two sentences. So normally what I would do is I would look at the featured snippet and then look at my result, and I would try and essentially copy that sentence just with more verbosity. So,
Verbosity. That's awesome.
yeah, I used to be a partner in brokenlinkbuilding.com, which is a tool that helped you do broken link building. And I also wrote the Broken Link Building Bible on Moz. And so I did an experiment. If you look for broken link building, the Moz snippet came up. So then I edited the snippet, or edited a piece of text on brokenlinkbuilding.com, writing the exact same thing, but just making sure the words link and broken and build occurred more often. And I stole it from myself. And then I edited my blog, and I just upped it up another notch and stole it back. So Google is pretty stupid on the featured snippet kind of thing. If you make it like a really dense piece of text, it's heavily using the words and phrases that matter, you're more likely to take it over. But it's an imprecise science.
With featured snippets, so have you guys done any kind of research? Like, let's say you search for, I don't know, Duke Energy customer service number, right?
Yeah.
Other than queries, do they look at to understand that there's actually a number associated with?
Yeah, I haven't spent much time with that. Dr. Pete is the search specialist in Moz, so he would be the one to ask about that. But yes, obviously they're figuring out what kind of answer a person is looking for.
Right.
But we've seen that technology on display in like IBM Watson on Jeopardy for years now. So that Google can do it now is pretty impressive. So it took you a while.
Yeah. Right.
Anybody else?
Well,
Thank you very much. I believe the tab might still have some beers left on it, and what's that?
Yes.
And next month is JP Sherman.
JP Sherman.
JP. I had no idea the topic, but hope to see you all next month. Thanks, everybody.
Here, let me pull up my computer, something that's